The metal post slammed into the ground before I could even step out of my truck. The sound rang sharp across the morning air, wrong in a way I couldn't ignore. I froze with my hand still on the door handle. That wasn't their property line. Not even close. Another strike. Steel on dirt. Deliberate. Confident. Like they knew exactly what they were doing, or worse, like they didn't care. I stepped out slowly. Gravel crunched under my boots, louder than it should have been. The smell of fresh-cut lumber mixed with wet soil drifted across the yard. It hit me then. They weren't marking a boundary. They were building one. On my land. A crew of 3 moved like this was routine. Measuring tape snapped. Nails clinked in a bucket. One guy wiped sweat from his neck and kept working without looking up. No hesitation. No second guessing. That's what made it feel off. I walked closer. Each step felt heavier, like something inside me already knew this wasn't a mistake. The post sat at least 10 feet past where my marker should have been. 10 feet doesn't sound like much. Until it's yours. I scanned the ground. The old survey stake was gone. Not broken. Gone. Like it had never existed. That was the first thing that didn't add up. I cleared my throat. One of the workers glanced at me, then back to his level. No apology. No confusion. Just silence. I followed the line they'd started. Post after post, stretching toward the back of the property. Straight. Clean. Permanent. This wasn't a quick fix. This was a decision. A choice someone signed off on. And I already had a feeling who. A white Lexus sat idling across the street, polished so clean it caught the sun like glass. The driver didn't get out. She didn't have to. I could feel her watching. That slow, patient kind of watching. Like she was waiting to see what I'd do. My jaw tightened. I looked back at the fence line. They were setting the corner post now. The anchor. The one that defines everything after it. Once that goes in, the rest follows. Fast. Too fast to stop if you're not ready. That's when I realized something else. They weren't rushing. They were comfortable. Like this had already been decided somewhere else. Paperwork. Meetings. Votes I was never part of. The hammer came down again. Harder this time. The post sank deeper. My land didn't push back. It never does. That's the problem. It just sits there while people decide what it belongs to. I took one more step forward. Close enough to see the measurement marks on their tape. Close enough to know they weren't off by inches. They were off by design. I could have stopped it right there. One word. One call. One scene. But something about the way they worked made me pause. There was too much confidence in it. Too much investment already happening. And confidence like that usually comes from thinking you're untouchable. I glanced back at the Lexus. Still idling. Still watching. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just a fence. It was a test. And they thought they already knew how it would end. I said nothing. Not yet. I just stood there, counting every post they set into my ground, because something told me stopping them now would be a mistake. I did not say a word while they finished the last post. I just stood there until the crew packed up and drove off like it was any other job. The air felt different once the noise stopped. Too quiet. The fence line stretched clean across the edge of my property, cutting into it like it had always been there. That was the part that bothered me most. It looked permanent. Like history had already been rewritten. I walked the line slowly. Each board was fresh, still smelling like sap and treated wood. My boots pressed into the soft dirt where their machines had torn it up. The ground still remembered what had just happened, even if nobody else seemed to care. I stopped where the old marker should have been again. Nothing. No stake. No paint. No sign it ever existed. That does not happen by accident. I crouched down and ran my fingers through the dirt. Loose. Recently disturbed. Someone had pulled it out clean. That meant planning. That meant intention. I straightened up and looked across the street. The Lexus was gone. Of course it was. She never stayed for the consequences. Only the decisions. I pulled my phone out but did not dial anyone. Not yet. That urge was there. Call a surveyor. Call a lawyer. Shut it down before it goes any further. But something held me back. The way they worked. The confidence. The timing. This was not rushed. This was calculated. And people do not calculate unless they think they are protected. I turned and looked toward the back of the property. The land dipped slightly past the fence line. Most people would not notice it. Just a gentle slope. But I did. I had walked that ground since I was a kid. I knew how water moved through it after a storm. Where it pooled. Where it drained. My father used to point it out to me with a shovel in his hand and mud on his boots. He would say land always tells you what it wants to do. You just have to listen. I had not thought about that in years. Not until now. I walked further down the fence, following it all the way to the corner. They had tied it perfectly into their existing yard. Clean lines. Seamless transition. If you did not know better, you would think it had always belonged to them. That was the illusion they were counting on. I leaned against one of the posts and looked out across their backyard. Empty for now. Just grass and open space. But not for long. You could see it already. The layout. The future plans. Patio here. Fire pit there. Maybe a pool. People like her do not build small. They build statements. And statements take time. And money. A lot of both. That was when the second realization hit. This was just the beginning. They were going to build on top of my land. Not just a fence. Something bigger. Something expensive. Something they would not want to tear down. I exhaled slowly. The tension in my chest shifted into something colder. More focused. I reached down and knocked on the post lightly with my knuckles. Solid. Set deep. Not going anywhere anytime soon. Good. I stepped back and took one last look at the line they had drawn across my property. It was clean. Confident. Wrong. I slid my phone back into my pocket. No calls. No confrontation. Not today. If they wanted to build, I was going to let them. Every inch. Every dollar. Every decision they thought they were winning. Because the more they put into it, the harder. It would hit later. And something about that felt right. I turned and started walking back toward the house, already replaying the layout of the land in my head, already thinking about what they had not seen yet, because they had no idea what sat just beneath that slope. I heard her before I saw her. The soft click of heels on pavement. Slow. Measured. Like she was timing it. I was halfway up my porch steps when the sound stopped behind me. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just close enough to be intentional. I turned slightly. She stood at the edge of the driveway, sunglasses still on even though the sun had shifted behind the trees. Perfect posture. Perfect hair. Not a single detail out of place. Victoria Hale never did anything halfway. She tilted her head just enough to look past me, straight toward the fence line. A small smile touched her lips. Not friendly. Not even polite. Just satisfied. That was the first real confirmation I needed. This was her. Not the crew. Not some mistake on a blueprint. Her. She took a few steps closer, heels tapping against the concrete in a steady rhythm. "You saw the new boundary," she said. Her voice was smooth. Almost warm. But there was something under it. Something sharp. I let a second pass before answering. "I saw a fence," I said. Simple. Neutral. She nodded like that answer amused her. "It aligns with the updated survey," she replied, already looking back toward the property line like the conversation was finished. Updated. That word hung there longer than it should have. I felt it settle in my chest. There had been no survey. Not one I was part of. Not one I had signed. I stepped down from the porch. Gravel shifted under my boots again, louder this time. "Funny," I said, keeping my tone even. "My survey says something different." She did not flinch. Not even a blink. That confidence again. The kind that only comes from thinking the paperwork is already in your favor. Or that nobody will challenge it. She slid her sunglasses up into her hair and finally looked directly at me. Her eyes were steady. Calm. Like she had already moved past this moment in her head. "Then you might want to have that reviewed," she said. No edge. No threat. Just a suggestion that felt heavier than it sounded. That was the second thing that did not sit right. She was not defensive. She was not arguing. She was inviting me to chase something. That usually means there is more behind it. I glanced past her toward the neighboring yards. Curtains shifted. Someone was watching. They always do. But nobody stepped out. Nobody said a word. That silence was louder than anything she could have said. I looked back at her. "You pulled the markers," I said. Not a question. A statement. Her smile tightened just slightly. There it was. The smallest crack. "The crew cleared what was necessary," she replied. Careful wording. Not a denial. Just distance. I let that sit for a second. The air felt still between us. Even the wind seemed to hold back. "That line cuts 10 feet into my property," I said. She folded her arms loosely, more out of habit than defense. "According to the association's records, it does not," she answered. Association's records. Not county. Not state. Not legal. Association. That told me everything I needed to know. She was leaning on internal authority. Not actual ownership. That is a different kind of confidence. Riskier. I nodded once, slow. Like I was considering her point. In reality, I was mapping it. Every word. Every angle. Every assumption she was making. "You planning to build back there?" I asked, shifting the conversation just enough to see where she would go. Her eyes flicked toward the yard again. That same satisfied look returned. "We are improving the community standards," she said. Not answering the question directly. That meant yes. And more than just a fence. I could almost see it now. The layout expanding. Concrete. Lights. Landscaping. Money. A lot of it. She adjusted her stance, ready to leave. The conversation had already served its purpose for her. A statement. A show of control. But she paused for one more second. Just long enough to make sure I heard what came next. "It is important that everyone respects the boundaries," she said softly. Then she turned and walked back toward the street without waiting for a response. Heels clicking again. Steady. Certain. The Lexus unlocked with a quiet chirp. She got in without looking back. The engine purred to life and the car rolled away like nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment, watching the empty street where she had been. The fence sat behind me. Solid. Wrong. Quiet. But now it had a voice. And I knew exactly where it was coming from. I turned back toward the yard, letting my eyes trace the full line again, because the way she said, improving, told me this was only the beginning. I noticed the trucks 2 days later. Not 1. 3. Parked along the curb like they belonged there. Engines off, but the metal still ticking as it cooled under the afternoon sun. I slowed my steps before I even reached the driveway. Something had changed. The air felt busier. Louder without noise. A man in a neon vest walked past me carrying a bundle of stakes. He did not ask who I was. He did not need to. That told me enough. I kept walking. Gravel shifted under my boots again, but this time it mixed with something else. The faint scrape of shovels. The dull thud of equipment hitting dirt. They had already started. I moved along the fence line, following the sound. Every few feet, a new marking flag stuck out of the ground. Bright orange against the grass. Clean lines. Measured spacing. This was not casual work. This was a full layout. I stopped near the midpoint and looked over. The yard on the other side was no longer empty. Sections had been cleared. Grass peeled back in long strips. The soil underneath was darker. Wet. Freshly turned. The smell hit me next. Damp earth and cut roots. It lingered heavy in the air. That smell always means change. Fast change. A crew had already started digging near the slope. Not deep yet, but enough to outline something larger. Rectangles. Clean edges. Foundations for something permanent. I watched for a moment without saying anything. Nobody looked up. Nobody hesitated. That confidence again. It ran through every movement they made. Like permits had been signed. Like approvals had already been stamped somewhere I had never seen. I stepped closer to the fence. Close enough to see the depth of the cuts. Close enough to know this was not decorative work. This was structure. One of the workers pulled a tape measure tight across the ground. Another marked a corner with a spray line. Straight. Precise. Expensive. I could already see where this was going. Patio. Retaining wall. Maybe even a pool. They were not just using the space. They were investing in it. That meant they believed it was theirs. Or that it would be. I rested my hand on the top rail of the fence. The wood was still warm from the sun. Solid. Steady. Wrong. I followed the line again with my eyes, tracing it back toward the slope. That dip in the land was still there. Subtle. Easy to ignore if you did not know what it did. But I did. I always had. Water never forgets its path. It just waits for the right conditions. A man near the back adjusted a small level and nodded to another worker. They shifted a stake half an inch. Not guessing. Not estimating. They were building to plan. That meant someone had drawn this out. Someone had approved it. Someone had decided that 10 feet of my land was worth taking. I stepped back from the fence and scanned the rest of the yard. More material stacked near the driveway. Pavers. Stone. Wrapped pallets of something heavy. This was not a weekend project. This was a full build. Weeks of work. Maybe months. And every hour they spent out here pushed it further. Made it harder to undo. That was the third thing that clicked into place. They were not worried about being stopped. They were counting on not being stopped. I turned slightly and looked toward the street. The Lexus was there again. Parked this time. Engine off. Sitting just far enough back to watch everything without being part of it. She was inside. I could feel it. Waiting. Measuring my reaction. Expecting something. A call. A scene. Resistance. I gave her nothing. I just stood there, taking it all in. Every measurement. Every line. Every decision they were making on land that was not theirs. My chest felt tight for a second. Not from anger. From timing. This was moving faster than most people could keep up with. Faster than permits usually allow. Faster than disputes usually resolve. That only happens when someone is pushing it forward on purpose. I exhaled slowly and stepped away from the fence. The noise of the work faded behind me as I walked back toward the house. I did not stop them. Not a word. Not a warning. Let them build. Let them commit to it. Because the deeper they went, the less they could walk it back. And something about the way they laid those lines told me they were about to build right over something they never even thought to check. I tried the simple route the next morning. Just to see how far she would push it. The HOA office sat at the edge of the subdivision, tucked between a row of trimmed hedges and a sign that still looked brand new. The glass door reflected me before I even touched the handle. For a second, I barely recognized the look on my own face. Not angry. Focused. That was new. Inside, the air smelled like paper and fresh paint. Too clean. Too controlled. A woman at the front desk looked up with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. I gave my name. She nodded like she already knew it. That was the first signal. I asked for the survey they used to justify the new boundary. She did not hesitate. She reached under the desk and pulled out a folder that was already prepared. Too fast. Too ready. That was the second signal. I opened it right there. The paper felt new. Crisp. Recently printed. Lines drawn in clean black ink, showing the adjusted property lines shifted inward. My land. Reduced. Reassigned. I flipped through the pages. Signatures. Stamps. Official looking, but something about it felt off. Dates that were too recent. Approvals that moved too quickly. This was not how real records worked. Not at this pace. I looked up at her. When was this filed with the county? I asked. She blinked once. Just once. Then her smile returned. All documentation is in compliance with association guidelines, she said. Not county. Not legal registry. Association. Again. The same pattern. Internal authority dressed up as something bigger. I closed the folder slowly. The room felt smaller now. Tighter. Like the walls were part of the same system. So this is not recorded outside of the HOA? I asked. Her smile held. We follow all required procedures, she replied. Careful. Avoiding. That was my answer. I nodded once and handed the folder back. No argument. No raised voice. That seemed to confuse her more than anything else. People usually react in here. They argue. They get loud. I did not. I just turned and walked out. The sunlight hit harder when I stepped back outside. Brighter. Sharper. Real. I stood there for a second, letting the heat settle into my skin. That little office had just confirmed everything I needed to know. They had built their entire claim on internal paperwork. No county filing. No official survey tied to the property records. Just a controlled narrative backed by confidence. That works. Until it does not. I drove straight to the county records office after that. The building was older. Brick. Worn steps. The kind of place that does not change often. Inside, the air smelled like dust and time. Real records live in places like this. Not in glass offices with polished desks. I pulled my file. The original survey. The one tied to the deed. The lines were clear. Unchanged. Exactly where they had always been. No adjustments. No updates. No filings to support what she had shown me. I ran my finger along the boundary line. Solid. Verified. Mine. That was the third confirmation. Not just a mistake. Not just a misunderstanding. A deliberate shift. I checked for any recent filings anyway. Just in case. Nothing. No amendments. No disputes recorded. No changes at all. On paper, everything was exactly as it should be. Outside, it was not. That gap between paper and reality is where people get into trouble. I stepped outside and took a slow breath. The city noise felt distant compared to the quiet certainty sitting in my chest. I could shut it down now. File a complaint. Force a halt. Bring in enforcement before they poured another inch of concrete. That would be the normal move. The expected move. But normal was not what they were planning for. They were moving fast because they thought time was on their side. Because the more they built, the more pressure there would be to let it stay. That logic cuts both ways. I looked down at the folder in my hands. Then back toward the direction of the property, even though I could not see it from here. They were building on something they did not understand. Something deeper than a line on paper. I slid the documents back into the envelope and headed for the truck. I was not going to stop them. Not yet. Because if they were willing to fake the boundary, I wanted to see how far they would go before it broke. The next week moved faster than I expected. Too fast for something this big. By the third day, the digging was done. Clean trenches cut through the yard like they had always been there. Wooden frames followed. Then steel. Then concrete trucks rolling in before sunrise, engines rumbling low in the cool air. I stood at the edge of the fence again, watching it all come together piece by piece. The sound of pouring concrete is different when you know it should not be happening. Thick. Final. Like a decision you cannot take back. They were not testing the space anymore. They were claiming it. I leaned on the fence rail, feeling the vibration from the machinery through the wood. Solid. Confident. Still wrong. A worker waved another truck forward. No hesitation. No checks. Everything ran like a schedule had been locked in weeks ago. That meant approvals had been given long before I ever saw that first post go in. That meant this was deeper than just her. I scanned the yard again. The outlines were clearer now. A large rectangular foundation near the slope. Smaller sections branching off toward the house. It was not just a patio. It was a full build. Multi-level. Designed to impress. Designed to stay. I stepped back and looked toward the house on their side. Windows open. Music faint in the background. Laughter. They were already enjoying it before it even existed. That kind of confidence does not come from doubt. It comes from believing nothing can stop you. I turned and walked toward my shed at the edge of the property. The door creaked when I pulled it open. Same sound it has always made. Inside, everything smelled like old wood and oil. Familiar. Grounded. I moved to the back wall and reached for the stack of rolled documents tucked behind a metal cabinet. They had been there for years. Untouched. I pulled them free and carried them outside into the light. The paper felt heavier than I remembered. I unrolled the first one slowly across the workbench. Lines. Measurements. Notes written in my father's handwriting along the margins. Precise. Careful. He never trusted memory when it came to land. He documented everything. I traced one of the lines with my finger. It ran straight through the area where they were pouring concrete right now. Not just a boundary. Something else. I shifted to the second page. More detail. Elevation changes. Flow directions. Small arrows marking how water moved after heavy rain. I remembered standing next to him as he explained it. Where it pooled. Where it drained. Where it needed to go to keep everything stable. That slope they were building on was not just a dip in the ground. It was part of a system. A quiet one. Invisible unless you knew how to read it. I looked back toward the fence. The concrete had started to set. Smooth surfaces forming where the forms held it in place. Clean. Permanent. They were sealing their decision into the ground. I tapped the edge of the blueprint lightly. The sound was dull against the wood. Real. Verified. Not like the clean prints in that HOA office. This was built on experience. On years of watching the land behave the same way every season. Water does not follow paperwork. It follows gravity. It follows paths carved over time. And those paths do not change because someone redraws a line. I rolled the pages back up slowly. My hands felt steady now. The tightness from before had settled into something else. Clarity. I carried the documents back inside and set them on the table near the window. From there, I could still see the movement outside. Workers stepping around the wet concrete. Adjusting forms. Preparing for the next phase. They were moving toward completion faster than most people would think possible. That told me one more thing. They were not planning for interruption. They were planning for permanence. I rested my hand on the edge of the table and watched for a moment longer. The light shifted slightly as the sun moved lower. Shadows stretched across the yard, touching the edges of their new foundation. Quiet. Patient. Like something waiting underneath it. All. I exhaled slowly and stepped back from the window. Let them finish. Let them build every inch of it. Because the more complete it became, the less they would be able to ignore what it was built on. And something in those old plans told me they had just poured concrete over a problem they could not see. The first rain came 3 nights later. Not a storm. Just a steady, quiet rain that started after midnight. I woke up to the sound of it tapping against the roof, soft but constant. For a moment, I just lay there, listening. Counting the rhythm. Something about it felt familiar. Then it clicked. I got up without turning on the lights. The house stayed dark as I moved toward the window. Outside, everything looked still. The fence line cut across the yard like a shadow. Beyond it, their new concrete reflected the faint glow of the sky. Smooth. Perfect. Untouched. That would not last. I stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, damp. The smell of wet soil rose up immediately. Stronger than it should have been after such a light rain. That was the first sign. I walked toward the fence, boots pressing into the soft ground. The slope ahead looked the same at a glance. But I knew better. Water does not show itself all at once. It starts small. Quiet. Patient. I reached the fence and rested my hand on the top rail. Cold now. Slick with moisture. I looked over. At first, nothing. Just rain tapping against concrete. Then I saw it. A thin line of water tracing along the edge of the foundation. Barely visible. Moving slow. That was the second sign. I leaned forward slightly, watching it. The line thickened. Not fast. Just enough to notice. It followed the exact path from the old plans. Same direction. Same curve. Like it remembered. I stepped along the fence, tracking it. Another line appeared closer to the slope. Then another. Separate streams, all finding the same route. That was the third sign. The ground beneath the concrete was already shifting. Not breaking. Not yet. Just adjusting. I could hear it if I focused. A faint sound under the rain. A soft, hollow tone where the soil had been disturbed too deeply. Most people would miss it. They would think it was just the rain. But it was not. I moved further down the fence. The water was pooling now at the lowest point. Exactly where the plans said it would. Exactly where they had poured the largest section of concrete. That was not a coincidence. I stood there for a long second, watching it build. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just steady. Consistent. Like it had all the time in the world. That is how problems like this start. Quiet enough to ignore. Until they are not. A light flick turned on inside their house. A shadow moved behind the window. Someone had noticed something. Maybe the sound. Maybe the reflection. It did not matter yet. It was still early. Too early for them to understand what they were looking at. I shifted my weight and looked back along the entire yard. The water was not stopping. It was spreading. Thin layers forming across the surface. Finding every low point. Testing every edge. Exactly like it always had. The difference now was what sat on top of it. Concrete does not adapt. It resists. And when it resists in the wrong place, something else gives. I exhaled slowly, feeling the cool air settle in my chest. This was just the beginning. A light rain. A simple test. Enough to confirm what I already knew. The system was still there. Still working. They had not removed it. They had just buried it. I stepped back from the fence and glanced toward their house again. The light stayed on. No movement outside. No one coming to check yet. They still thought everything was fine. I turned and walked back toward the porch, the sound of rain following me across the yard. It tapped against the roof again as I stepped inside. Calm. Ordinary. Nothing alarming if you did not know what it meant. I paused at the door and looked back one more time. The water had not stopped. It had only started to find its path, and I knew it was going to keep following it. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground had not. I stepped outside just after sunrise, the air still heavy with moisture. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No machines. No workers. Just a stillness that did not feel right. I walked toward the fence again, slower this time. The soil on my side was soft. But stable. It always had been. I reached the top rail and looked over. That was when it changed. The surface of their new concrete no longer looked clean. Thin patches of dark moisture spread unevenly across it. Not puddles. Not yet. Just damp spots where water had begun to push upward from underneath. That was not supposed to happen. I stepped along the fence, tracking the pattern. It was not random. It followed the same lines I saw in the rain. The same invisible routes beneath the surface. That was the first confirmation in daylight. I leaned closer, studying the edges where the concrete met the soil. Small gaps had formed. Barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. The ground had shifted just enough overnight to create space. That was the second confirmation. I moved toward the lower section near the slope. The soil there looked darker than the rest. Saturated. Holding more water than it should have after such a light rain. I pressed my boot down gently. The ground gave slightly, then held. Not collapsed. Not yet. But it was close. That was the third confirmation. I straightened up and looked across the entire yard. The design was still there. Clean lines. Sharp edges. But now something underneath it was starting to disagree. I heard a door open behind the fence. Quick. Sharp. Someone stepping outside faster than usual. I did not turn right away. I already knew what they were seeing. A voice followed. Not calm this time. What is that? Another voice answered, lower, uncertain. I turned slowly. Victoria stood near the edge of the patio area, arms slightly raised as she pointed toward the dark patches. Her posture was different. Not composed. Not controlled. Just a fraction off. That was new. She stepped closer to the surface, careful with her footing. Watching it like it might change again. She looked down, then across the yard, then back at the house like she was trying to connect something that did not make sense yet. That was the moment. The first crack in certainty. I stayed where I was. Silent. Watching. A worker arrived a few minutes later, still holding his coffee. He stopped when he saw the ground. No greeting. No instructions. Just a pause. He crouched down and touched the edge of the concrete. Pressed lightly. Then looked back at her. That look said more than words. Not panic. Not yet. But concern. Real concern. I stepped back from the fence slightly, giving them space without leaving. The morning light made everything clearer now. The moisture patterns had spread just enough to be visible from a distance. Not dramatic. Still subtle. But no longer invisible. That was all it needed to be. She turned toward the fence for a second. Her eyes scanned across it. Not directly at me, but close enough. She knew I was there. She knew I had seen it. But she said nothing. Not yet. That was important. If she believed it was a simple issue, she would have dismissed it. Made a comment. Kept control of the moment. She did not. She stayed quiet. That meant she was not sure. And uncertainty is where everything starts to shift. The worker stood up and said something I could not hear. She nodded, but the motion felt delayed. Like her mind was somewhere else. Already trying to calculate the next step. I turned away slowly and walked back toward the house. No rush. No reaction. Just steady steps across the yard. Behind me, I could still hear them moving. Talking. Adjusting. Trying to figure it out. But they were already too late for that. The system had started. It had been waiting under the surface the entire time, and now it had something to push against. I heard the trucks come back before I saw them. Not as many this time. Just one. It idled longer than usual, like the driver was waiting for instructions that were not coming fast enough. I stepped outside with my coffee still warm in my hand. The air smelled different. Damp, but with something heavier underneath. Wet concrete has a distinct scent when it starts reacting to water the wrong way. Most people do not notice it. I do. I walked toward the fence again, slower than before. No rush. No urgency. On the other side, the yard was no longer quiet. Two workers stood near the foundation, talking low. One of them pointed toward the darker sections. The other shook his head slightly. That small movement told me more than anything they could say out loud. They were not sure how to fix it. That was important. I rested my arm on the fence and watched. The surface had changed overnight. Not cracked. Not broken. Just uneven. Subtle dips forming where the soil underneath had shifted. Enough to notice if you knew what you were looking at. Enough to ignore if you did not want to see it. That was where she stood. Right in between. Victoria stepped out a moment later, phone already in her hand. Her walk was quicker now. Less controlled. She moved straight to the center of the yard and stopped. Looked down. Then around. Then back down again. The same motion repeated twice. That loop meant she was trying to make sense of something that did not match her expectations. I took a slow sip of coffee. Still warm. Still steady. She said something to the workers. I could not hear the words, but I could see the tone in her shoulders. Sharp. Direct. She wanted answers. They did not have them. One of the workers crouched again and pressed his hand flat against the surface. Held it there longer this time. Then lifted it and rubbed his fingers together. Testing the moisture. That was not routine. That was concern. I stepped along the fence a few feet, keeping the angle clear. The lower section near the slope looked worse now. Not dramatic. Still quiet. But the water had not drained the way it should have. It had stayed. That was the problem. It was not leaving. I could see faint lines where it had tried to move and then stopped. Blocked by something above. Concrete does that. It traps what should move freely. And when it does, the pressure builds in places people do not expect. A third worker arrived with a small tool bag. He set it down and started checking the edges along the forms. Tapping lightly. Listening. That hollow tone was back. Clearer now. Even from where I stood. That sound travels differently through solid ground. It tells you where the support is weaker than it should be. He paused after a few taps and looked up at the others. No words. Just a look. They all saw it. That was the moment the problem became real to them. Not just a surface issue. Something underneath. Victoria turned slightly toward the fence again. This time her eyes met mine for a second. Not long. Just enough. There was no smile now. No controlled calm. Just calculation. Fast. Active. She looked away first. That mattered. She stepped back and started pacing a small section of the yard. Short steps. Tight turns. Phone still in her hand, but not dialing. Not yet. That meant she was still deciding how to frame it. How to present it. How to control it. That window does not stay open long. I set the empty cup on the fence post and crossed my arms. The wood creaked slightly under the weight. Familiar sound. Grounded. Everything on my side still felt stable. Solid. Unchanged. That contrast made it clearer. This was not random. This was specific. Targeted by the land itself. The worker with the tool bag stood up and brushed his hands off slowly. Then he said something I could not hear, but I could read it in the way Victoria stopped moving. Completely still for half a second. That is when it hit her. Not the full picture. Not yet. But enough to know this was not going away on its own. I picked up my cup again and turned back toward the house, because the way she froze in that moment told me they were about to realize how deep this actually went. The call came later that afternoon. Not from her. From someone else. A number I did not recognize. I let it ring once before answering. The voice on the other end was measured. Professional. An engineer. He introduced himself and mentioned the property next door without saying her name. That told me everything. He was already trying to stay neutral. I leaned against the kitchen counter and listened. He asked if I had any records of drainage or subsurface design on my land. Not ownership. Not boundaries. Drainage. That was the first real shift. They were no longer defending the line. They were trying to understand what sat beneath it. I glanced toward the table where the old plans rested. Still rolled tight. Still waiting. I kept my voice calm. I have original documentation, I said. A pause on the line. Short. Controlled. He did not expect that. Would you be willing to share it? He asked. Careful again. Respectful. That was different from the tone she used. I looked out the window. Across the fence, the yard was quieter now. Work had slowed. Not stopped. Just slower. People moved with less certainty. That was enough for now. Depends on what you are trying to fix, I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear him choosing his words. We are seeing unexpected water retention under the new structure, he said finally. Unexpected. I almost smiled at that. Water does not do unexpected. It does exactly what it has always done. People just forget to look. That slope has a history, I said. Simple. Direct. He exhaled lightly on the other end. Not frustration. Recognition. He knew what that meant. Was there a system in place? He asked. I tapped my finger lightly against the counter. A slow rhythm. Thinking. Not about the answer. About the timing. They were reaching out now because they had to. Not because they wanted to. That mattered. There still is, I said. I let that sit. No explanation. No detail. Just enough to shift the weight back onto his side. He did not respond right away. I could hear faint movement behind him. Voices. Low. Tense. They were all trying to solve something they did not fully understand. We need to assess the extent of it, he said after a moment. Assess. Another careful word. I pushed off the counter and walked toward the window again. The light had shifted. Shadows cutting across the uneven surface of the concrete now. Making the dips more visible. More real. You already have, I said quietly. He did not argue. That was important. Engineers do not concede easily. Not unless the data in front of them forces it. If the system is active, it may require adjustments, he added. Adjustments. That word felt smaller than what they were facing. I rested my hand against the glass. Cool. Steady. That depends on what you built over, I said. Another pause. This one heavier. He knew that question. And he knew he did not have the answer yet. That was the gap. The one I had been waiting for. Would you be available to review the plans with us? He asked. There it was. Not a demand. Not a request from her. From him. From someone who understood that this was not going to resolve with surface fixes. I looked. Back at the table again. The rolled documents sat exactly where I left them. My father's notes still hidden inside. Lines that had never changed. Paths that never moved. I walked over and placed my hand on top of them. The paper felt firm under my palm. Certain. I will consider it, I said. No commitment. No timeline. Just enough to keep them waiting. He thanked me. Polite. Controlled. Then the line went quiet. I ended the call and stood there for a second. The house was still. Outside, the yard across the fence was not. Movement continued. Slower now. More cautious. They were already trying to adjust without knowing what they were adjusting to. That never works. I picked up the rolled plans and carried them back toward the window. Not opening them yet. Just holding them. Watching the space where everything had started to shift, because the way they reached out today told me they were finally looking in the right place, just not deep enough. I did not wait long after that call. The next morning, I walked across the yard with the plans in my hand. The air was dry again, but the ground remembered. It always does. Each step felt steady on my side. Solid. Predictable. That contrast made everything clearer. I stopped at the fence and looked over. The surface had changed again overnight. The dips were deeper now. Not dramatic, but no longer subtle. You could see it without trying. That was new. The crew was already there. Fewer people this time. No heavy machinery. Just tools and quiet conversations. That told me they had paused the build. Not by choice. By necessity. I rested the rolled plans against the fence and waited. It did not take long. The engineer from the call stepped forward. No hesitation this time. He walked straight toward me, stopping just short of the fence line. Close enough to speak without raising his voice. "You said there was a system," he began. Direct. No small talk. I nodded once. "There is," I said. I did not hand him the plans. Not yet. He glanced past me briefly, then back to the yard. Measuring. Comparing what he saw to what he expected. They never match in situations like this. "We need to understand how it moves," he said. I studied him. For a second. He was not defensive. Not dismissive. Just focused. That made him different from her. That made this conversation useful. I unrolled the first section slowly across the top rail. The paper caught the light, lines coming into view piece by piece. His eyes dropped immediately. Locked onto the details. That reaction told me he knew what he was looking at. "This slope is not decorative," I said. Simple. Clear. It channels water across the entire lower section. He leaned in slightly, following the lines with his eyes. "And you built directly over it," I added. No accusation. Just fact. He exhaled quietly. Not surprise. Confirmation. "We thought it was stable ground," he said. Thought. Past tense. That mattered. I tapped one of the markings with my finger. A small arrow. Barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. "It is stable," I said. "As long as the flow is not blocked." He nodded slowly. That connection had already formed in his head. I could see it. He glanced back at the concrete again. The uneven surface. The moisture patterns. Everything lined up now. "We can redirect it," he said after a moment. There it was. The solution. Quick. Clean. In theory. I rolled the edge of the plan slightly, then stopped. "You can try," I replied. I let that hang. He looked back at me. Not defensive. Just waiting. "But that system was designed for open ground," I continued. "Not sealed surfaces." Another pause. This one heavier. He understood the difference. Water needs space. Once you remove that, it finds its own way. Usually in places you do not want it. He straightened slightly and looked across the yard again. The crew had stopped working entirely now. Watching. Waiting. Even from a distance, I could feel the shift. They were no longer building. They were assessing damage. That line is hard to cross back from. "If we remove sections," he said slowly, choosing each word, "we might be able to relieve the pressure." Might. That word carried more weight than he wanted it to. I rolled the plans back up halfway. Not closing them. Not offering more. Just enough to show I had what they needed. "That depends on how much you are willing to take out," I said. He did not answer right away. His eyes moved again. Measuring the space. The cost. The time. Everything that had already been committed. That calculation takes longer than most people expect. I stepped back from the fence slightly, giving him room. Not physically. Mentally. He needed it. Everyone does at that moment. The moment when they realize fixing it will cost more than building it did. Behind him, Victoria stood near the edge of the patio area. Still. Watching. No phone in her hand this time. No pacing. Just silence. That was new. I looked at her for a second, then back at him. He followed my glance but did not turn fully. He already knew she was there. We should review this in detail, he said finally. Professional again. Controlled. But slower now. Less certain. I nodded once. Not agreeing. Not refusing. Just acknowledging the step. Then I rolled the plans closed completely and picked them up. The paper felt heavier than before. Not because it had changed. Because now they understood what was inside it, and something told me they were about to see how much of it they would have to undo. The next 2 days changed everything. The yard never returned to what it was supposed to be. Even when the sun stayed out, the moisture did not fully leave. It lingered under the surface, pushing up in the same places, following the same hidden lines. I watched it each morning. Same pattern. Same slow spread. That kind of consistency is not a fluke. It is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. By the second afternoon, the crew stopped pretending it was minor. No more light taps. No more quick checks. They brought in measuring tools. Levels. Moisture readers. Real assessments. The engineer was there again, earlier this time. Focused. Quiet. He walked the entire section twice before saying anything. That told me the numbers were not what he wanted to see. I stood at the fence, arms resting on the top rail, watching the shift unfold. No one looked relaxed anymore. Even their movements had changed. Slower. More deliberate. Like every step needed to be checked. That is what happens when confidence breaks. Victoria arrived shortly after. No heels this time. Flat. Shoes. Practical. That alone said enough. She stepped onto the edge of the concrete and paused. Testing the ground. Feeling for movement. There was just enough give to notice. Not enough to collapse. But enough to warn. She stepped back quickly. That reaction was instinct. Not control. I could see it in the way she held her posture afterward. Slightly tighter. Slightly less composed. The engineer walked over to her and spoke quietly. I could not hear the words, but I saw the change in her face. Subtle. Controlled. But there. The realization was setting in. This was not a surface fix. This was structural. She looked across the yard, then toward the fence. Her eyes stopped just short of meeting mine. That was different. Before, she held eye contact like she owned the outcome. Now, she avoided it. That told me she understood the shift in control. The crew started marking sections of the concrete with chalk. Small circles. Lines. Areas to test further. Areas to remove. They were already planning partial demolition. Not a full tear out yet. Just enough to try and relieve pressure. That was the first real concession. I watched one of the workers score a line along the edge of the largest section. The sound was sharp against the quiet yard. Not construction anymore. Correction. That sound carries differently. He paused halfway through and looked back toward the engineer. Waiting. The engineer nodded once. Short. Final. That was all it took. The next pass went deeper. I shifted my weight slightly against the fence. The wood creaked under the pressure. Familiar. Steady. Everything on my side remained unchanged. That contrast was no longer subtle. It was obvious. The ground had chosen its side long before any of this started. They just had not known it. Victoria stepped closer to the engineer again, this time speaking faster. More direct. Her hand moved as she pointed across the yard, outlining what had already been built. The scope. The investment. Everything tied into that space. He listened. Nodded once or twice. But his eyes kept returning to the ground. That is where the truth was. Not in the plans. Not in the approvals. In the way the soil reacted. In the way the water stayed. She stopped talking suddenly. That break in motion was noticeable. Like she had run out of ways to frame it. For a second, the yard went completely still. No tools. No voices. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in right before a decision gets made. The engineer finally straightened and looked across the entire area one more time. Then he spoke. I could not hear the words, but I saw what they did. The crew stopped moving completely. No hesitation. No argument. Just stillness. That is what final instructions look like when everyone understands the weight behind them. Victoria did not respond right away. She just stood there, staring at the marked sections of concrete. The circles. The lines. The places that were about to come apart. Her shoulders dropped just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. But enough. That was the moment it settled. Not just a problem. A loss. I pushed off the fence and took a step back, letting the scene hold without me in it, because the way they froze in that silence told me they had finally reached the point where fixing it would mean undoing almost everything. They started cutting the next morning. Not all at once. Section by section. Controlled. Careful. The sharp grind of saws against concrete replaced the steady rhythm of construction. It sounded different. Final in a different way. Not building. Undoing. I stood on my side of the fence again, hands resting on the top rail. Same position. Different scene. The chalk lines they marked yesterday had turned into clean cuts. Pieces of the surface lifted in blocks, exposing the soil underneath. Dark. Wet. Unstable. It did not take long for the pattern to show again. Water pooled immediately in the exposed sections. Not from rain. From below. That was the part they could not hide anymore. The engineer moved with the crew, directing where to cut next. Short instructions. Precise. No wasted motion. He had already accepted what needed to happen. Victoria had not. She stood near the edge, watching each section come apart. No phone. No pacing. Just stillness. That kind of stillness comes when control slips and there is nothing left to grab onto. A larger section came up near the slope. The sound of it breaking free was heavier than the rest. The soil beneath shifted slightly as the weight lifted. Not collapsing. Just adjusting. Reclaiming space. I watched the water follow it instantly. Filling the gap. Finding its path again like it had been waiting for this exact moment. The engineer crouched and traced the flow with his eyes. No confusion now. No hesitation. He understood it completely. Too late to avoid it. Just in time to see the full extent. I stepped along the fence, following the progress. Each removed section revealed the same thing. Saturated ground. Hidden movement. Pressure that had nowhere to go until now. They were not fixing it. They were exposing it. And the more they exposed, the clearer it became. This was not a localized issue. It ran through the entire lower section. Exactly as the plans showed. Exactly as it always had. One of the workers set down his tool and wiped his hands slowly. He looked across the yard, then back at the open sections. That look said everything. This was bigger than expected. Much bigger. The engineer stood and walked toward Victoria. This time, he did not lower his voice. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. Full removal. That was the phrase that carried. Short. Heavy. Final. She did not respond right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground. On the sections already gone. On the ones still intact. That calculation again. Cost. Time. Loss. Only now it was real. Not theoretical. Not avoidable. She shook her head once. Small. Almost reflex. Then stopped. Because there was nothing to argue against. The ground does not negotiate. The crew paused again, waiting. Not for instruction on how to continue. On whether to continue. That is a different kind of pause. I stepped back slightly, giving the scene distance. The sun had shifted higher now. Light falling directly across the exposed soil. Making the water shine where it collected. Clear. Visible. Impossible to ignore. Victoria finally looked up. Not at the crew. Not at the engineer. At the fence. At the line that started all of it. Her gaze held there for a second. Longer than before. Then she turned away. That was it. No words. No orders. Just a turn. The engineer nodded once to the crew. That was enough. The tool started again. Louder this time. Faster. Not careful removal anymore. Full teardown. Sections came up one after another. The sound echoed across the yard. Each piece exposing more of what had been buried underneath. By midday, most of it was gone. The clean lines replaced by uneven ground. Open soil. Water moving freely again. Not perfect. Not pretty. But stable in its own way. The system had space to breathe again. I rested my hands on the fence one last time and looked across the entire section. What they built was gone. What was always there remained. The difference was clear now. Some things you can redesign. Others you cannot. I turned and walked back toward the house without looking back, because the sound behind me had already changed from building to breaking, and something told me they would never try to draw that line again.